Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Chris. I am the assembly person for Politicus. I was just recently elected in the last general elections in May, which also was the general elections which saw the first regime change in Malaysian history on the federal level. So yeah, May was a historical elections for Malaysia, and I considered myself fortunate enough to having been part of that change. Now, you know, coming from a democratic country, Malaysia, I would say, has just become a democratic country after 61 years, when we have seen for ourselves that we could actually change the government, so that the power of democracy actually lies in the hands of the citizens of this country. And with that, the United States of America, you know, if you look at the history of our two countries, basically, yeah, the United States of America was born out of a war and in the American Revolution against their British masters at the time. And Malaysia was born also for independence from the British. However, the Americans had to actually literally fight a war in order to gain their independence, and ours was negotiated. So there are some similarities, and there are then again a lot of differences as well between our two countries. But one of the key things that is evident is that the relations between our two countries have always been very different throughout the years and throughout many different leaderships and all that. But that is the beauty of democracy. Democracy is a system that allows us to change the leadership or the direction of a country should we disagree with the direction that it is going. So therefore, relations will change as long as a democracy is thriving. You know, America, being a democratic country, has had many precedents. And since the presidency of Harry Truman and the implementation of a two-term limit in the system of presidential elections, leadership has been a lot, a leadership change has definitely become a certain thing in the United States. In Malaysia, following the British parliamentary system, Prime Minister can actually stay there for quite a long time, if the Prime Minister were to maintain their majority in Parliament. However, for Penang itself, I believe Penang, in the last State Assembly, Penang tabled a bill to amend the constitution of the state of Penang, and now the position of the Chief Minister of Penang has been limited to 2 terms. I believe Penang has made history in a sense of becoming one of the first sort of Westminster parliamentary legislator to actually limit a term of their head of government. Because in most Westminster system kind of legislator, there was no such thing as a term limit for the head of government. Anyway, just a brief understanding of the differences between our two countries. I would like now to introduce to you our speaker, which is Dr. Pamela Sodhy. Now, just to give a brief background on Dr. Sodhy, she presently teaches part-time in Georgetown University as an Adjunct Associate Professor in the Asian Studies program at the School of Foreign Service. She also gives occasional lectures on Southeast Asia at the US State Department's Foreign Service Institute, or the FSI. Prior to that, she taught for many years at Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, where she was an associate professor in the history department. She is the recipient of the American Field Service Scholarship and American Council of Learned Societies Research Fellowship and the Fulbright-Hays Grant. She has also served as an Honorary Secretary, Malaysian International Affairs Forum, and the President of the Malaysian Association for American Studies, as well as the Secretary General of the Asian Federation of American Studies Associations. She now serves on the Board of Directors of the Malaysia-America Society and the Malaysia-America Foundation. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, tonight, thank you for coming, and let me now introduce to you Dr. Pamela Sodhy so that she can give us this main lecture today on the US-Malaysia relations. Please give her a round of applause.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And I'd like to say, ladies and gentlemen, how delighted I am to be here today. I've heard so much about the Penang Institute, and I'm actually here, so this is good. The aim of my talk is to highlight the main developments in the bilateral relationship between the US and Malaysia. My scope is a 61-year period since 1957, and it covers political, economic, and socio-cultural aspects. The organization is in 5 parts as follows. First, an overview, then sections on the past, present, and future, and a conclusion. The overview is meant to show different stages in this relationship. First, the early stage, pre-independence with indirect relations. It shows that the relationship was triangular in nature because Britain was the colonizer and Malaysia was then called Malaya. At this early stage, we need to note that the US already needed tin and rubber from Malaya. Tin since the American Civil War in the 1860s for the tin plating industry to store food in tins. Then rubber for the US automobile industry at the turn of the 20th century, and both rubber and tin for the US war effort as in World War I and World War II, and for the US stockpile program. The next stage is the 45 to 57 period, which saw the start of the Cold War. And we have US, including Malaya, in 3 Cold War missions in Southeast Asia, the Jessup mission, 1949, and the Griffin and Melby missions in 1950. This period also covered the start of the emergency in Malaya, which began in 1948 and dragged on until 1960. The next stage was independence in 1957, when the US-Malaya relationship changed into bilateral relations and direct relations and no longer triangular. It was marked by the exchange of ambassadors, but with Britain still in charge of Malaya's defense. And we need to know that the US was fine with that because at that time, the US was already involved in the First Indochina War. It helped the French against the Vietnamese. Then you get the next stage, the post-independence stage, to 1917 to 2017. We get 6 Malaysian premiers in office, and they had 12 US counterparts, the US presidents. Then we have the current stage of the relationship, 2018 with Dr. Mahathir and President Donald Trump. And this will be followed by some comments on the future stage. So now I shall deal with the first period with Tunku Abdul Rahman and with 4 US counterparts. First, it's important that I point out that the bilateral relationship began as lopsided. Lopsided because the US was a superpower, whereas Malaysia was a rural agricultural nation, what was then known as a third world nation. So this early period of independence was marked by socio-cultural programs such as the American Field Service Program for Teenage Exchange and the Asia Foundation Program, both begun in 1957 for help with the youth programs in Malaysia, legal work and communications. This period was also marked by much economic ties. There was the US Investment Guarantee Agreement 1958, under the 1954 Mutual Security Act, which gave military, economic and technical assistance, helping Malaya with the 57-58 recession. Then you get 2 US loans to Malaya worth $20 million under America's Development Loan Fund for construction of roads and bridges and for deep water port facilities at Port Klang. The economic ties, however, were marred by some tensions over the start of the US tin and rubber stockpile disposal program in September 1959. These affected the price of rubber and tin and hurt Malaya. Meanwhile, to fight the communist insurgency, the Eisenhower administration gave limited supplies of small arms and ammunition to Malaya. Why? Because it feared the domino theory would come true. Some people laughed at it, some people didn't. Some were worried that if Vietnam or Malaya fell, the other countries would fall. The US was worried about the effect on Britain. Britain was an important NATO ally, and it depended on funding from exports from Malaysia. The Tunku made a visit to the US in 1960, but by this time Eisenhower had served 2 terms, and you get a new president in Kennedy. The Kennedy-Tunku period, 60 to 63, is important in the relationship for several reasons. One reason is the stronger economic relationship seen in 2 US trade missions to Malaya. The first mission, 1961, said that US goods were of high quality and well received, but too expensive. The second mission in 1963 helped to improve the situation, and US sales increased. At that time, there was trouble over the US stockpile disposal program, as they adversely affected the tin and rubber price, and Malaya complained. In fact, the US tin and rubber disposal program soon became the most destructive element in the bilateral relationship in its early years. This period was also important for US involvement in Vietnam and for what is known as the Malaysian connection in the Vietnam War. There was a connection in several ways. One way was Malaysia's appreciation of the US effort in Vietnam to provide security and stability to Southeast Asia. So when the US asked Malaysia for help, Malaysia said it wouldn't send troops, but it could give non-military assistance to South Vietnam, and it did so. One way it did so was by giving equipment from the emergency when it ended. This was sent to South Vietnam and much appreciated. Another way was Malaya allowed South Vietnamese officials to train in counterinsurgency and police administration in Malaya. Then it also allowed US servicemen to go to Penang for R&R leave. But this was soon stopped because the nature of the tourist trade and the fear of the spread of venereal diseases. So Penang soon shut down that offer. Then there was admiration of Malaya's use of the resettlement plan named after a British commander, General Briggs, and how well it worked in Malaya. And it worked well in Malaya because the people rounded up and resettled were Chinese migrants with no roots to the soil and not much political or economic clout. So it was so successful in Malaysia, and the police network and intelligence network was so good that the US copied it in Vietnam, sent British commanders to help, but it failed. It failed because the analogy was faulty. Why was it faulty? In Vietnam, they moved indigenous Vietnamese with strong roots to the soil to the new villages. And what did they do? They got so angry, they jumped into the arms of the communists. So it was completely different. This was the strategic Hamlet's plan, copied because it was so good in Malaya, but didn't work in Vietnam. And then we need to know that this period is also important for other reasons. The start of the Ford Foundation Program, 1962, to help with development planning, agricultural diversification, and educational reform. Then, more important, the start of the Peace Corps program in 1962. The PCVs arrived that year, the first batch, and they were hugely successful. They were clever, humble, and willing to work hard. They rode bicycles, they taught English, they taught mathematics, they worked in Sabah and Sarawak, did rural projects. So it was a very, very popular program. Then you get the start of the Fulbright Commission known as MACI in Malaysia, 1963. And this helped to foster mutual understanding between the US and other nations because of Senator Fulbright. Why is it so important for US-Malaysia relations? Because with the PCVs, they heightened US technological and scientific knowledge and paved the way for the recognition of US degrees. Because Malaya was a British colony, there was bias against American degrees. They were not recognized. But with MACI and the Peace Corps volunteer program, the Malaysian government did recognize US university degrees by 1966, a big accomplishment. Also very important, this is the period of the formation of Malaysia. The US welcomed this, and the US also supported Malaysia when Indonesia started its confrontation policy, 63 to 66. In fact, Kennedy was the president when confrontation started, and at first he tried to mediate between the two Southeast Asian nations. We are now at the Tunku LBJ period because Kennedy was assassinated November 1963, and Johnson became the new US president. We need to know that Kennedy took a softer line against Indonesia, but Johnson took a harder line. For instance, he told Sukarno, stop this nonsense about hitting at Malaysia, or we will stop aid. And they did cut off some aid. But when Sukarno persisted with attacks and other forms of retaliation, Johnson said, we're going to cut off all aid, all levels, and Sukarno said, to hell with your aid. And then we need to know that Johnson supported Malaysia at the UN Security Council, sent a US flagship at Port Swettenham. And then we get the fall of Sukarno in the coup, September 1965, the rise of Suharto, and the end of confrontation. So besides siding with Malaysia during confrontation, which marked the first political intervention by the US in Malaysia's affairs, the LBJ period is also very important for his visit, the first by a US president in October 1966. A kampong was later named after LBJ. Ironically, before he came, there were protests against his visit and against US involvement in Vietnam. But when he came, things were fine, and the visit was considered a success. However, you do get some tensions during this time, during a US loan to Malaya. The US asked for 5% interest. Malaysia checked it and found out that others only paid 3%. So Malaysia was able to renegotiate it and to stop its anger. Meanwhile, ASEAN was formed in '67 with Malaysia as one of the 5 founding members, and the US welcomed this development as ASEAN was then pro-West and anti-communist. You get high-level visits in '67. Tun Hussein went to the US, and you get Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, coming to Malaysia. That year, you had the highest number of PCVs in Malaysia, in the world, 558, and they were doing magnificent work. LBJ did not run for re-election because of trouble with the Vietnam War, and Richard Nixon became the next president. And since Nixon had to leave, and during this period, what we need to know is that Spiro Agnew made a short visit in 1970, and during this visit, he praised Malaysia for being part of ASEAN, for its good economy, and gave Malaysia a moon rock because of the US space flight. The US, now we need to know that the Tunku had to step down in Malaysia because of the riots, and the new premier was Tun Abdul Razak. The Razak period was important for several reasons. One was the US helping Malaysia with its new economic policy after the racial riots of '69. The US helped with the restructuring of Malaysian society and the eradication of poverty. Here we need to know the good work done by the Peace Corps volunteers and by Macy. We also need to know that the US fostered diversification of Malaysia's agriculture and economy by promoting oil palm. One of the US ambassadors, Baldwin, claims credit for pushing this. Other changes were US oil companies started offshore oil exploration in Malaysia. Then you get US firms starting investments in the electronics industry. You get less problems with the US rubber and stockpiles. By 1973, the US was Malaysia's 3rd largest trading partner. Then there was an important happening, 1971, the 5-power defense arrangement with Malaysia, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore about Malaysia's defense after the British withdrew east of Suez. They decided in 71, they postponed it till the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, and we need to know that the US was okay with this arrangement because it had its hands full in Vietnam. This period, it was also important for a hostage situation in Malaysia that showed good cooperation between Malaysia and the US. In 1975, 5 members of the operations unit of the Japanese Red Army seized the US consul and 52 hostages at the AIA building in Kuala Lumpur. The gunmen demanded the release of 7 members of the Red Army in Japan, and the crisis ended safely when 5 of these prisoners were sent, and Razak handled it well, and it showed good US-Malaysia cooperation. The period also saw the end of the Vietnam War, but this was not good for the relationship in that thousands of Vietnamese refugees flooded into the region, including Malaysia, and Malaysia saw this as a security threat. By then, Tun Razak was in ill health and was succeeded by Tun Hussein Onn. So now we are on this period, and the whole period was affected adversely by the Vietnamese refugees problem. You get some tensions flaring up, some conflicts, because they landed on the East Coast, and they were seen as Chinese, even though some were Vietnamese. It was true that many were Chinese, because the first batch of Vietnamese refugees were political prisoners. The second batch were economic migrants, refugees, and the third batch was mainly Chinese Vietnamese who had become the scapegoats when Vietnam's economy went south. And they were forced to leave because they were told they were not wanted, they were blamed. So many of them fled to Southeast Asia, but created a problem for Malaysia, which saw them as problems in case of what Malaysia called a residual effect. If they didn't leave, if they intermarried with the Chinese and caused more racial problems. Now we need to know that the domino theory, which was criticized, did come true after 1975, because Saigon fell April, Cambodia fell same month to the Khmer Rouge, and Laos also fell to the communists. And when this happened, because of the communist threat being more real, the US offered limited military aid to Malaysia, and Malaysia accepted FMS credits, foreign military sales. It accepted the IMET program for international military education training for Malaysians. You also get very good cooperation between the two countries to fight drug trafficking and drug abuse. This was seen as a national problem because of more drugs from the Golden Triangle area of Southeast Asia. There was some trouble though with Malaysia regarding palm oil. The US soybean lobby faced a glut in soybean production and pressed for a duty on palm oil. But the Malaysian government protested against it as it saw it as protectionist sentiment. Then we need to know that when Carter succeeded Ford as the US president, the refugee problem from the Vietnamese reached a crisis point in 1979. Crisis point because 70,000 had landed at Pulau Bidong, which couldn't hold so many. And Dr. Mahathir said, stop coming. But they kept on coming, so Dr. Mahathir said, I'm going to shoot on sight any that land. And they stopped coming. He later said, I never said it. but it did the magic. They stopped coming for some time. Meanwhile, good cooperation on the socio-cultural level. For example, Serdang Agricultural College sent its students for staff training at LSU, Louisiana State University. Mara sent students to Ohio University for training. And in 1980, the Tun Razak Chair in Malaysian Studies was established at Ohio University. In the Reagan period after Carter, Malaysia was upset by two economic issues. One, the US sale of tin on the world market by the US General System Administration, GSA, at a time when the tin price was low, and by US countervailing duties on Malaysian textiles. The US AFL-CIO petitioned the US government to revoke these GSP privileges, and Malaysia was angry with this and protested. Hussein Onn was then ill and was succeeded by Dr. Mahathir. The Mahathir period saw the continuation of the Vietnamese refugee problem till 1996. There was also trouble with palm oil due to the soybean lobby, which now allege that palm oil is a saturated fat with high cholesterol content. The Malaysian government fought back and got the US government to block efforts to legislate mandatory labeling of palm oil as a saturated fat. So now Malaysia more assertive and not going to take all the knocks. Also, you get tensions over US countervailing duties on textiles from Malaya in 1980 and a petition by the AFL-CIO to revoke Malaysia's GSP privileges. On the other hand, good relations over Macy, the Peace Corps. You get the founding of the Malaysian Association for American Studies in 1983, and this week I attended the 35th anniversary meeting. You get the formation of the Malaysia-America Society in the US. You get more Malaysians studying in America. You get the start of the twinning programs between Malaysian colleges and US universities and colleges. And by 1984, 24,000 Malaysian students in the US, the highest number since. Also the end of the Cold War, 1990, and good relations in fighting the narcotics threat, but still trouble over the Vietnamese refugees. In 1990, the US Congress withheld $1 million in IMET funding for Malaya over what it said was the bad way of making the Vietnamese boat people go back to sea. So this was considered a human right abuse. You get some trouble with Malaysian problem of some military equipment. The Malaysians bought 88 US Navy Skyhawk equipment. Some didn't work, and some had to be sold back in the US. Meanwhile, you have the Gulf War taking place, and the US was in a dilemma because on the one hand, it was in the UN Security Council, and on the other hand, some were sympathetic to Saddam Hussein. And the Malaysian government was then relieved when the war ended quickly. The Mahathir George H.W. Bush period also saw tensions on the GSP issue, which Malaysia saw as protectionist sentiment. Also contentious was Dr. Mahathir's East Asia Economic Grouping proposal, which excluded the US He said that since the EU could have an organization of its own and North America could have NAFTA, why not Malaysia and other countries in the area have their own East Asia Economic Grouping? It was later changed to East Asia Economic Caucus, and it was still opposed by the US, but we need to know it has become the ASEAN +3. It then morphed into the EAS, the East Asia Summit, and the US is now a member. We are now on the Dr. Mahathir Clinton period, and we need to know that the first term of Clinton started well with the 30th anniversary of Macy, with the rescue of US soldiers from Somalia by Malaysian peacekeepers, by the establishment of the Malaysian Chair in Islamic Studies at Georgetown University in 1994, and by the meeting between Dr. Mahathir and Clinton 1994 and 1996, and at last the end of the Vietnamese refugee problem 1996. However, the second term was marked by tensions, first over the Asian financial crisis, regarding clash of views over causes and solutions. Dr. Mahathir saw the currency dispute by speculators as the main headache. The US saw several reasons: corruption, cronyism, the lack of transparency, collusion between business and government, and they also clashed on handling it. Dr. Mahathir believed in currency controls, instituted them, and was proven right. He believed in priming the pump. The US, with the IMF and the World Bank, believed in cutting subsidies on fiscal control, and Anwar was a member of the IMF. He too believed, unlike Mahathir, in fiscal controls. Then you get tensions over America's attempt to investigate the Petronas gas deal in Iran, and tensions when Dr. Mahathir sacked Anwar Ibrahim, and Anwar Ibrahim was brought to trial on charges of corruption and sexual misconduct. More trouble when Al Gore visited Malaysia and talked about the brave people of Malaysia for seeking reform. This irritated Dr. Mahathir, and he was happy and said so when the election between Gore and Bush was decided by the US Supreme Court in a very tight vote, 5-4 vote, and Dr. Mahathir said he was glad who won. 8 months later, you get September 11, and you get the transformation in US-Malaysia relations, with Dr. Mahathir giving open support to the US. And Malaysia became the most important Muslim country in Southeast Asia, helping in the war against terrorism, because Indonesia was in no shape with political, economic, socio-cultural problems and leadership problems. And Malaysia was also highly respected because it came up with the ZOCFAN policy, with the EAEG, and with the Vision 2020. Then you get more and more cooperation between the two on fighting terrorism. And you also have Malaysia helping with the capture of Hambali in Bangkok. You have Malaysia helping with the Southeast Asia Regional Center for Counter-Terrorism, Siasat, more FMS credits to Malaysia, curbs on money laundering by Malaysia, and Malaysia allowing US air and port facilities in the country. Then we have Malaysia letting the US military use jungle warfare training in the country, and the US conducting training for US Navy SEALs also in Malaysia. There was some problem over US treatment of Taliban prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and the restriction on Muslim men traveling to the US. The US fought against Afghanistan and Iraq, and this annoyed Malaysia. And then Malaysia didn't like Bush's doctrine of preemption in fighting terrorism. On the other side, the US was angry with Dr. Mahathir's anti-Jewish remarks at meetings. But by this time, the US was the 10th largest trading partner of Malaysia in 2003. And we also have a new premier in Badawi. Badawi had a high profile for Malaysia because he was chair of the OIC, chair of the NAM, the non-aligned meeting, and then we need to know that he became chair of the ASEAN Standing Committee. This time you have the US Customs Service Container Initiative, more things to fight terrorism, the Proliferation Security Initiative, and you also have the US offering to patrol the Malacca Straits. Malaysia said thank you, but no thank you, and had its own Eyes in the Sky program for patrolling with Indonesia and Malaysia, and now Thailand is part of it. But Malaysia was wise and accepted the US offer of Marine Police training, and now you have the US Coast Guard helping Malaysia. They cooperated on the 204 tsunami. Malaysia helped the US with the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. And you get Malaysia being proactive about anti-terrorism when it said it would have the death penalty for those involved in terrorism. There was also some tension over US concern about nuclear proliferation by Malaysia, such as in the SCOMI case, and opposition against US policy in the Middle East. But on the socio-cultural level, things were good. There was less trouble with Anwar after 2004 when Badawi released him, but trouble again in 2008 when he was accused of sexual misconduct again. By then, Badawi was on his way out because he had done badly in the 2008 elections. And you get the Najib period. So now we're on to the Najib-Obama period and the Trump period. So you get Najib replacing Badawi in 2008, 2009. You get Obama engaging more with Southeast Asia during this time, having good relations with Najib. They met several times over the nuclear summit in 2010. And then at one meeting, Najib proposed the teaching of English in Malaysia again, and this led to the Fulbright program for English teaching. Najib also had this global movement of the moderates, and then you get a very good meeting with Hillary Clinton in 2010 when some agreements were signed. You get more defense ties between them. You get Malaysian terrorist Nordin Top being arrested. And then you get Obama starting the Waisili program for youth, which was very good and well accepted. And then you get Obama's important meeting in Malaysia in 2015 when they established the Comprehensive Partnership Agreement with Malaysia. You get Obama's pivot policy and rebalancing, you get the TPP, and then you have the Obama Sunnyland Summit meeting in California in 2016. We need to know that the Najib-Obama period began well but ended badly with the IMDb scandal. And regarding the Trump period with Najib, Trump had campaign pledges to withdraw from the TPP, to ban Muslim migration to the US, and he kept to both pledges. Trump had 2 trips to Southeast Asia in 2017 to Da Nang and to the Philippines. We need to know one thing about Trump that is very important. He did help with fighting terrorism. Under him, more than under Obama, the US has been very strict with Syria. Obama talked about not crossing the red line, but when Syria did, he didn't do much. Whereas under Trump, the ISIS, the second layer of terrorism, the first layer was Al-Qaeda, has been defeated in Syria and in Iraq, but the ISIS grouping is moving to Southeast Asia, as seen in the Marawi siege in the Philippines. There was also a plan by Najib to buy 8 Boeing Company 787 jets from the US, worth $2.25 billion, but as of yet, this deal hasn't materialized. So now we go to the present period. How many more minutes? 5, okay? Yes. So on the political level, the good aspects are that Dr. Mahathir has started reforms which are well received by the US against corruption. For example, the scandal is being addressed at present, the IMDb scandal. And what is also good is Dr. Mahathir is friends again with Anwar. This is like a Shakespearean drama. And it shows that Dr. Mahathir has mellowed from earlier days. His language is not so harsh to everybody. Then we need to know that there are changes in cabinet positions under Dr. Mahathir. Now we have a Chinese as the finance minister, Indian as the attorney general. He's talking of abolishing the death penalty, and there's more cooperation than ever on fighting terrorism. There are challenges on the political level because we have Trump's policies. He's now talking of a free and open Indo-Pacific. They used to stress the Asia-Pacific. Now it's Indo-Pacific. His recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which annoys Muslim nations, his pro-Israel policy, his ban on Muslim nations entering the US, and then the 2018 ASEAN meeting, he didn't attend, he sent Pence instead. Then there's the Fat Leonard case involving the US Navy. The US Navy was built by an Asian defense contractor who charged much more than we should have. This was Leonard Glenn Francis, and the case is still on. And then we need to know that on the economic level, the US-Malaysia trade is $50.2 billion. Malaysia in 2017 is the largest trading partner of the US among the 10 ASEAN states. The US is Malaysia's 4th largest trading partner. The US has abandoned the TPP. Now there's a TPP 11. The US is not joining. Dr. Mahathir is saying he's reviewing it, whether or not it is good for Malaysia to join. We are having more protectionist sentiment from the US. There's also trouble with China and the US. And Trump has included Malaysia in a list of top contributors to the global US trade deficit. On the socio-cultural level, things are very good on educational exchange, on Fulbright programs, cultural exchanges. There's a problem though with trafficking in persons, about prostitution. Malaysia is on the tier 2 wait list. It used to be on the 3rd list, and it now wants to be on the 1st list. There's still very, very good cooperation over the YCD program, over the US English teaching program, over the Ambassador for Cultural preservation, and US is appreciating Malaysian films and Malaysian activities, including cuisine. And we need to know that the US is still a superpower, but Malaysia has been transformed. It has become a near first world country. As for future direction of US-Malaysia relations, it depends on the leadership factor in both countries, how they will lead their own nation. Another variable is the economy in both countries. If it's bad, there'll be protectionist sentiment. A third variable is the geopolitical concerns such as counterterrorism. It's gone on for 17 years, how long more, when it's draining the economy of the US. There's also the role of China in the world that needs to be considered. China wants a place economically and politically. It's the second biggest economic power. It has beaten Japan in second place. So we have to watch that. And in conclusion, I'd like to touch on the main areas of cooperation and tension and the major themes. So the main areas of cooperation are trade, education and cultural exchange, counterterrorism, narcotics control, and teaching of English by the Fulbright program. The main areas of tension are the stockpile program, rubber and tin, palm oil issue, GSP privileges, countervailing duties on textiles, Vietnamese refugee issue, human trafficking report, and human rights over UNRWA and over the Vietnamese refugees. Then we need to be aware of issues sensitive to both sides. The US is sensitive about talk on Israel or criticism. Malaysia is sensitive about Muslim issues, about how the US treats the Palestinians. We need to know that this is an inbuilt problem. It's not going to run away by itself. It's not going to go away. It's going to be there. They have to deal with it. They have to deal with it with tolerance, with understanding, and with compromise. The major themes are economic issues, then the Cold War theme, then the containment theme, then we need to know economics is dominant throughout, and containment was until 1990. Then you get strategic concerns such as security, with confrontation and with terrorism, human rights, a legal issue with the UNRWA crisis, and with the Vietnamese refugees. And since 9/11 counterterrorism, the socio-cultural theme is still growing and amicable. And in 2018, the most important theme in the relationship is counterterrorism. The second one is economics. Thank you very much.